International news now.
So today we're moving on to a different foreign policy dilemma, perhaps crisis for the Biden administration. This controversy began approximately 2 weeks ago with the announcement of a new agreement among the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, in which the United States and the United Kingdom would supply new nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Well, that seems simple enough. Two longtime democratic allies, the US and the UK, providing military technology to a long-term democratic partner, Australia. However, the deal greatly upset another democratic ally, France, who reacted very harshly, including recall its ambassadors from both the United States and Australia, which constitutes a diplomatic break, a significant diplomatic break. And the French are upset because they had a deal in place to sell submarines to Australia, but that deal was broken. So suddenly this arms deal began as another example of ongoing tensions between the United States and its long-term allies in Europe. So we're going to break down the story for you because it has important implications for thinking about major ongoing shifts in U.S. foreign policy. So we're going to explore the controversy in 4 parts. The first section simply describes and explains the arms deal at the heart of this story and why it is noteworthy as a shift in military strategy for Australia and the United States and important democratic allies, including both Australia and the United Kingdom. Second, we're going to describe the harsh French reaction, what the French government said and did to express its frustration with this deal and the cancellation of its submarine deal with Australia. Third, we're going to take a step back and ask, why all the fuss? What makes this arms deal so important anyway? And what's the long-term effect of France's diplomatic break with both the United States and Australia? Finally, we're going to talk about the broader context that animates this episode, centering on 2 developments: the rise of China as an economic, political, and military challenger to U.S. hegemony, and cracks in the alliance of established democracies that seem to be emerging despite President Biden's promise to restore these very relations in the aftermath of the damages that he ascribed to the Trump administration. So, Rob, why don't you get us started here by breaking down this arms deal for us?
Okay, sure. So we're going to start with a clip from PBS NewsHour that highlights the main elements of this arms deal and its importance, and we'll run that clip now.
This evening at the White House, President Biden, joined by the prime ministers of the United Kingdom and Australia, announced a new partnership in the Indo-Pacific region. Chief among the announcements, an effort to build nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. The one issue not mentioned by the 3 leaders, but clearly driving this move, a rising China. Our foreign affairs correspondent, Nick Schifrin, is here with me now with more. And Nick, tell us what it was that the president and the 2 prime ministers announced.
Yeah, so this was what they called a landmark defense and security partnership known as AUKUS, Australia, UK, US. This is about sharing technology, sharing defense industries, and cooperating militarily. They talked about defending shared interests, but as you just said, they didn't mention China. But this is about defending shared interests against a rising China. Take a listen to President Biden and Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who appeared at the White House virtually.
Our nations will update and enhance our shared ability to take on the threats of the 21st century, just as we did in the 20th century, together. Our nations and our brave fighting forces have stood shoulder to shoulder for literally more than 100 years. Through the trench fighting in World War I, the island hopping in World War II during the frigid winters in Korea, and the scorching heat of the Persian Gulf.
AUKUS, a partnership where our technology, our scientists, our industry, our defence forces are all working together to deliver a safer and more secure region that ultimately benefits all.
This is a giant strategic step for Australia, Judy. I asked Alan Tidwell, who directs the Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies at Georgetown, how significant this was for Australia to decide this. And he said it was the most important announcement, most important decision that Australia has made since the early 50s, since the Australia-New Zealand-U.S. treaty.
This is a significant upgrading of the alliance between the United States and Australia, and a significant statement about the role that Australia envisions for itself and the United States in the region.
And increasingly, that role is a united one, Judy. The U.S. and Australia against China. For Australia, the U.S. becomes closer to them, and the alliance with the U.S. becomes more resilient. And the U.S. Gets an ally that is much more capable of deterring China on its own.
So how is the United States doing that militarily?
This is the premier announcement today, what you said, nuclear-powered, conventionally armed submarines for Australia. This is some of the U.S.'s most trusted, most secret technology. The U.S. has historically refused to provide this technology to anyone, including its partners. In fact, the only time the U.S. has ever shared this technology was with the U.K. more than 70 years ago. Australia currently has diesel-electric submarines, so it's a big investment for them to switch to nuclear submarines, and those nuclear submarines, nuclear-powered submarines, will allow them to deploy farther, deploy more stealthily, stay in strategically important areas, like the South China Sea, like Southeast Asia, even as far as Taiwan, that China has been using territorial claims throughout that region.
Don't distract me. All right. We're back. And so let me just reiterate the main elements of the AUKUS deal. See, he used AUKUS too. Professor McDonald was making fun of me in my explanation of the acronym AUKUS. And he did an impression that I am still kind of hurt by, and I'm going to cancel a gala because of it. That's not okay.
You just had to get that joke in. All right.
I did.
All right.
It was funny. Okay. So, this submarine deal, it's a pact for the United States to supply Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. That's the heart of the deal. The big controversy here, and we'll talk much more about this in a second, Australia canceled an already existing deal for submarines that were not nuclear-powered, but conventionally powered submarines with France. And they canceled that deal to take this deal with the United States. These submarines have nuclear reactors for propulsion, but they do not, and this is very important to note, they do not have nuclear weapons on board. They are not they don't have nuclear weapons for defense or anything like that on the ships. They are just nuclear-powered submarines. The United States and the UK will share top-secret nuclear technology with Australia. The only time that the United States has shared this technology was with the UK many years ago, and so this is also a big change for the United States to share this kind of top-secret technology with an ally. And most importantly, the reason why everybody's doing this is it will substantially increase Australia's naval power. Nuclear-powered submarines provide a set of advantages over conventionally powered submarines. They have longer range and greater speed, and so they can go on patrols for a lot longer time and at a lot longer distance. They can evade, adversaries more easily, etc. They are also less detectable because, again, with nuclear propulsion, they don't have to come back to the surface as often, so they can stay underwater longer, and these submarines are more maneuverable. So Australia gets a much more powerful navy out of this partnership, and one that is integrated with the United States technology and also with American strategy in the Pacific, because what the United States gets out of this by investing in Australia is a partner who is geographically situated in a strategic place that can then use that technology to confront and oppose China in the South China Sea and in the Pacific, where a lot of the most troublesome conflicts and actions by the Chinese are taking place. So that's the deal. Pat, this all seems relatively reasonable as an arms deal that happens all the time, right? I mean, but one country wasn't very happy about this, and it was not China, although China's not happy about this either, but it was France. And so let's get into that side of the story.
Yeah, so let's start with the substance of this reaction from the French, which was swift and harsh. And we're going to start with a short clip, another one from the PBS NewsHour on the French reaction. So go ahead and run that clip now.
We return to the U.S., British, and Australian decision to build nuclear-powered submarines for Australia, a move sparking fury among other allies, the French. France had a $40 billion agreement with Australia to build 12 conventionally powered submarines. That deal is now in doubt. With me is the French ambassador to the U.S., Philippe Etienne. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. The United States, the Biden administration is saying that this is all about the Indo-Pacific. It is not directed at France. So why is your government angry?
Well, this is a point. We are also very much involved in the Indo-Pacific. France, of course, is a European country, but we are also an Indo-Pacific country. We have territories, we have populations, we have armed forces, both in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean. And we have presented or introduced already 3 years ago our own Indo-Pacific strategy with a security and military component, but also with other elements. And we've just updated this strategy. And now the European Union as such is presenting its own strategy. So we are very active. We have also the goal of a rule-based order, multinational order, and free circulation and democratic values in this region. And so we are obviously disappointed by what happened and how it happened.
So before we get into the reasons that France is so mad about this deal, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the response itself and how harsh it was. So first, France took some dramatic actions to signal its displeasure with U.S. policy, with Australia, and the new arms deal that it was left out of. First, the French government angrily canceled a gala event at the French embassy in Washington, D.C., and a corresponding celebration aboard a French frigate in Baltimore. The events were meant to celebrate the French Navy's aid to the U.S.'s fight for independence in 1781. Now, while it all might sound a bit frivolous, these ceremonies are an important part of diplomacy, and this particular event was meant to highlight the more than 200 years of friendly relations and mutual aid that France and the United States have provided to one another. Of even greater significance, the French government recalled its ambassadors from the capitals of both the United States and Australia. And finally, French President Macron was slow to agree to a call with Biden to discuss the deal. This was a conscious decision to further signal France's displeasure and perhaps switch the tables on the US president, making Biden the one who had challenges getting a close ally to take his phone call when asked. And so the two presidents did eventually talk by phone some days later, and that call seemed to settle down the dispute. Now, besides these actions, perhaps even more striking was the harsh rhetoric coming from high-ranking French officials, including the president and his foreign minister, and we list some of the quotes on the next slide here. France basically accused the United States and Australia of lying about the deal by keeping it secret until it was completed. French officials also talk of a foundation or a real breach of trust among all the parties. But perhaps most striking, French officials compared President Biden to former President Trump. They accused Biden of acting like former President Trump, even if he doesn't talk like him. And the choice of words is important here. Unilateral, brutal, unpredictable. Unilateral recalls the America First foreign policy that Trump championed, but Biden aggressively rejected. Unpredictable also hits at a big part of Biden's brand, so to speak, competence. He sold himself as correcting the erratic foreign policy, often through tweets by President Trump. So what President Macron and other French officials seem to be saying here is that Biden might sound a little bit different from Trump, but the United States is acting in many of the same ways as it did under the Trump administration.
Okay, so France is pretty angry, but now we're going to break down exactly why that's the case. And so we're going to run another clip and then talk over the reasons for France's frustration with the United States and, to a lesser extent, with Australia. So let's run that clip now.
Absolutely furious because they have put years of high-level talks and high-level diplomacy into this, up to the highest levels of state. The French President Emmanuel Macron himself being involved in the discussions. The foreign minister, then defense minister, when he made the deal with the Australians. They've had a deal in place for 5 years. The early parts of the deal have been inked already. They've put pen to paper, and this is going to cost the French $65 billion. It's a huge amount of money, especially relative to the size of the French economy. So that's why the French are furious. And also, they didn't even get the courtesy of a heads up, they say, from either the Australians or the Americans. So they feel that they've been messed around. They feel that they were here first. They were already drawing up plans for conventional submarines and to provide those to the Australians. And then the Americans changed their foreign policy priorities, decided that aggressive containment of China was their #1 priority, and that Australia was a key part of that strategy. And France was collateral damage, Kim.
Okay, so there are several specific grievances and complaints about the deal itself and how it was handled for the French. And so they're angry about both substance and process. And so what are these sources of French frustration? First, there's a real economic side to this story. The cancellation of the French deal to supply submarines for Australia is a huge financial loss for the French defense industry. It canceled a deal that was worth, according to the estimates I saw, of about $66 billion. And, you know, you have to also put it into context that the French defense industry is a much smaller one than, say, the American defense industry, and so this would be a big hit for them. The second big complaint from the French government is the lack of transparency and consultation. There was a real shroud of secrecy around this deal between the French and the UK and Australia. They purposely hid details of the deal until it was a completed one and irreversible. And there were times when the French, according to the French, they asked about what was going on, and the United States and Australia purposely kept them out of the loop. Thirdly, there is a problem with some international humiliation here, and you see this in that first quote from the French official in the interview. You know, he says, like, look, we have interest in that region as well. We are a sort of global power, and we have some rights here, especially because we already had a deal in place. And so not only is it that they lost a bunch of money and they are offended by the lack of consultation, but this really was sort of an international humiliation for France. France was collateral damage, as the last quote said, because the United States changed its foreign policy. Australia changed its mind on who it wanted to partner with to increase its capacity to confront China. And, France was kicked to the curb, so to speak. And that, for a country with such a long history like France has, and for a country, again, and this is what goes back to like canceling a gala, celebrating, an event 200 years ago in which France helped the United States gain independence. This was a humiliation because France sees itself as perhaps the longest ally of the United States, that they were there at the birth of the United States when the United States was fighting for independence from the United Kingdom. And it feels like this is not a way for the United States to treat such a trusted and longtime ally. And there is one more consideration to come into this, and that is President Macron can't really afford this kind of humiliation right now because he is facing re-election in 6 months. And so this crisis poses a challenge for him. Now, it does pose an opportunity as well. A lot of commentators have noted that a little anti-Americanism in French elections is kind of useful for a candidate. And so Macron might be politically well-served in his re-election campaign if he aggressively challenges the United States on this. And so that's perhaps part of the reason he was so angry.
Yeah, and we can combine those third and fourth points too. There's a consistent debate in French foreign policy about, are we still a great power? And this is the question that's being asked now. And that has domestic political implications because there are some segments of the French electorate that want to maintain great power status. Right. And so this is how it could factor into the election. Macron isn't defending France's larger great power role in the international system, not defending perhaps its interest in the Indo-Pacific region, and as a consequence, this could be a domestic political problem for him. But again, in the larger backdrop, there are interests within France that want to maintain France's global position as a great power. So let's transition to some of the broader significance here. We know why the US, the United Kingdom, and Australia signed a deal for nuclear power subs. They're trying to counter China. We know why France is angry. They lost out on a big contract and feel lied to and humiliated. But this, on some level, still feels like a spat between members of the Democratic family that everyone will eventually get over with. But there's arguably more to it than that. And so let's start with a clip from the New York Times, the Daily podcast, about this broader context. So go ahead and run that clip.
Mark, I have to tell you that when I first heard about this news, about a deal with Australia, I really didn't understand the significance of it. So can you tell me plain and simple, what is this? What is this deal?
Well, it's understandable because it's one of these things where when you first look at it, it doesn't necessarily look like that huge a deal, right? It's a deal between Australia, the United States, and Britain to supply nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. But what makes it really such a landmark is that, in essence, the U.S. and Britain are sharing their most secret nuclear technology with another ally, Australia, to enable them to build and operate a class of submarines that they otherwise would never have access to. And that really makes it stand out. So it's not only a huge deal in terms of monetary value, it's a really strategically important deal, one that sort of changes the equation, not just over the next 5 years, but really over the next 25, 30 years.
What do you mean?
This is Australia being brought into a really uniquely close alliance with the United States and Britain to really face off against China in the Asia Pacific. This is going to be the great geopolitical confrontation of the coming era, and Australia is sort of lining up with the U.S. and Britain to be committed to this new, much more aggressive posture toward China.
So let's highlight a few things from the clip here. As it notes, the arms deal is actually more than simply supplying a close ally, Australia, with newer, more powerful submarines. It's part of a wider shift to make China the centerpiece and countering growing Chinese influence the centerpiece of U.S. foreign policy. It should be noted here that President Biden is not unique among recent presidents that are highlighting China as the preeminent long-term threat to U.S. national security. He's also not the first president to try to reorient U.S. foreign policy towards centering on this containment or countering of China. Both President Obama and President Trump also wanted to shift attention in the United States and shift U.S. resources and military strategy away from other threats, such as wars in the Middle East, to preparing to be in a better position to confront a rising and threatening China. So the first thing that makes the deal so important and controversial is the signals that it sends. The U.S. is signaling that it plans to confront Chinese military advances in the Pacific and in the South China Sea with a very concrete and substantial military investment in Australia, which is strategically situated in the Pacific region to help the U.S. counter Chinese ambitions there. And this broader shift is controversial because a global competition with China poses some risks to all sides. Many commentators and politicians speak of a new Cold War emerging, this time between the United States and China. There are flashpoints, like the status of Taiwan and free navigation in the South China Sea, that threaten to escalate or spark a deeper military confrontation or perhaps a crisis or war between the United States and China. Now, the deal is also significant because Australia and the United Kingdom are signaling that they will side with the U.S. in this emerging competition with China. Australia's biggest trading partner is China, so this move could have very important economic and political implications for Australia if China decides to try to punish it for siding with the United States. But there's an even broader context here as other countries start to take sides and view this deal through the prism of their own relationship with the United States. For example, the United States has another security relationship known as the Quad among the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. Therefore, this deal with Australia has implications for India and Japan, who are members of the Quad grouping.
But
right?
not part of the AUKUS.
But not part of AUKUS. So the AUKUS deal might end up degrading the Quad, and India and Japan may also see themselves as having a lower status in U.S. strategy than Australia. And we can see this ripple effect clearly with the collateral damage that the submarine deal with Australia has had on the U.S. relationship with France. But this conflict with France can also be seen as part of a wider division in the alliance of democracies, particularly in Europe. As we saw with the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan, European countries seem to be growing increasingly critical of the United States and the Biden administration. They were hoping and expecting a renewed relationship with the United States under President Biden, in part because Biden had promised to make that one of his foreign policy priorities. But now they're finding, with this shift to countering China, they might not get the attention and consultation they were expecting. So if this perception persists, it could threaten Biden's other main foreign policy goal of revitalizing relationships with the world's democracies, particularly in Europe.
Yes, exactly. So, okay, so let's talk briefly about what the United States and other countries are so concerned about with the rise of China. I mean, if this deal is all about countering China, I think it's important to think through a little bit about what the threat, especially militarily, China provides here in the Pacific and in the South China Sea. And so we have another clip here on Chinese actions and military strategy, particularly in the South China Sea. And so let's run that now.
Is stepping up its presence in the South China Sea. The Chinese government has maneuvered hundreds of militia ships into the disputed waters, effectively blocking access for the maritime activities of other nations. A report in the New York Times says China is attempting to, quote, accomplish by overwhelming presence what it has been unable to do through diplomacy or international law. China's recent moves come after they built and fortified with military bases a series of man-made islands in the region starting in 2014. They did so despite competing claims from Taiwan, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. The U.S. has no official position on territorial claims in the South China Sea, but has criticized China's tactics. U.S. Navy warships have been dispatched to patrol the area 3 times since President Biden took office. The New York Times Beijing bureau chief, Stephen Lee Myers, joins me now from Seoul, South Korea. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us. So what do these latest moves say about China's military and political posture?
I think China is very intent on controlling these claims that they've made virtually over all of the South China Sea, based on historical claims that these have been traditional fishing grounds for the Chinese for centuries. And they've built up islands, as you mentioned, that out of what were essentially just reefs, uninhabited spaces. Over the last few years, they've built entire cities on them. And in this case, what they've done is in a reef that's claimed by the Philippines, parked essentially hundreds of ships, beginning in March and then continuing even now, despite the protests that the Philippines and the Vietnamese have made.
And how are nations with competing claims responding to China's recent moves, and how does the need for vaccines complicate this?
Well, in the case of the Philippines, once they noticed the presence of so many ships, at one point more than 200, they protested diplomatically by calling in the ambassador in Manila. But there's not a lot they can do other than use force to expel them. And that's the challenge for these other nations. The Philippines, Vietnam also claims the same islands in this area. And, you know, it's obviously a major escalation to use force against the ships. And I think China knows that. In the case, you know, in the Philippines in particular, you know, they are relying on Chinese vaccines to handle the pandemic. And some of those arrived, in fact, just last week, the first batch, and they're expecting more. So it's a delicate dance that they have to conduct with the Chinese, you know, to protect with their own claims, but then also not alienate the Chinese government.
So let me make a few points here to reemphasize what the clip has sort of presented as a picture of the rise of China and some military threats that incurs. The rise of China economically, politically, and militarily is now seen as the primary threat to the U.S. on all of those fronts, military, but also economic and political. And this is partly due to the sheer size and power of China. It is the second largest economy in the world, and it will pretty soon, by most projections, surpass the United States and become the world's largest economy. And that poses some economic competition that really animated President Trump's approach to China to try to reset the trade balance and the trading relationship between the United States and China. But as this clip just showed, China is seen as a threat to the United States also because it has a very different political and economic system than the U.S. and pursues very specific policies that directly threaten U.S. interests and the interests of U.S. allies. And so let me just sort of list a few of these really specific areas of concern. First, there are the territorial claims that China is making in the South China Sea. These claims are harmful to China's neighbors because countries like Vietnam and the Philippines also claim some of these islands and waters that China has essentially taken over as its own. And this also potentially threatens shipping lanes and trade routes if China is allowed to control which countries are permitted to sail their vessels through key areas like the South China Sea, because China has built a bunch of man-made islands that they then claim as their territory and all the surrounding ocean around these new islands. And so that's one big issue that has been around for quite some time, that is a contentious issue for China, its neighbors, but also for the United States and other powers who want to maintain free navigation of the seas. Now, there's other issues as well. One of the most significant ones is that China poses a threat to a key American ally in Taiwan. Now, the status of Taiwan is complicated, and we're not going to fully explain that right now, but Taiwan has enjoyed a certain degree of autonomy, even though China claims Taiwan as part of its own territory. However, China regularly, and has kind of been pretty aggressive in it recently, threatens to reintegrate Taiwan into mainland China politically and by force at some point if necessary. And this is a constant source of tension between China and Taiwan, but also between China, Taiwan, and the United States, because the United States has sort of has a definite interest, but sort of also a vague sort of commitment to help Taiwan defend itself. And finally, there are also other Chinese policies that run counter to American values and threaten American interests. And so China's repression of the democracy movement, for example, in Hong Kong, and human rights abuses of Muslim minorities, such as the Uyghurs in China, are two good examples of this, and how these actions further draw some concern from the United States and its allies and the West as human rights abuses. And so for all of these reasons, the United States has decided under the Biden administration to really put a lot of resources and attention into reorienting its foreign policy to counter this rising Chinese threat. And so let's start wrapping things up by noting the broader context then of the French objections to this deal. Now, the Biden administration began its tenure in office with a public commitment to rebuild ties with democracies, and in particular to rebuild ties with its European democracies in NATO. And this was done very consciously as drawing a dramatic difference between the Biden administration and the Trump administration and its rhetoric, which was much more skeptical of the role of NATO and the burden sharing that NATO employed, in which the United States provided a lot of the security, and the Trump administration complained and really cajoled and pressured its NATO allies to increase their contributions to the alliance security expenditures. And so what Biden promised to do was to reestablish the strong historical ties between the United States and NATO and its European allies as a correction from that episode under the Trump administration. And European allies, though, have now sensed a discrepancy, we'll say, between the rhetoric of the Biden administration that was during his campaign for president, during the first years of his administration, but even as recently as his speech at the United Nations, talking about cooperating with democracies to tackle many of the world's biggest problems. There's a discrepancy they're voicing between that rhetoric and the actions that are taken by the Biden administration in recent weeks here. First, with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, which they said wasn't done with enough consultation and discussion with European allies, and now, perhaps even more starkly, with this AUKUS deal, in which the United States partners with Australia to supply nuclear-powered submarines and sort of throws a NATO ally, France, under the bus in the process. And so there's that is the sort of broader context of this, is that this is beginning to look like a pattern, if you will. And this brings us to our final point, and that is there's a tension here potentially in President Biden's dual foreign policy goals, that those being countering China as the preeminent threat to U.S. National security interests, economic interests over the long term, and having and reviving and rebuilding strong ties with democracies around the world as a sort of community of states that the United States can lean on to solve all sorts of problems, from climate change to security issues in Europe, to human rights abuses and the like. Now, I believe that Biden is genuine when he says he believes in alliances and wants to rebuild strong ties with democracies. He's genuine in his beliefs that the United States should cooperate with democracies around the world to promote democracy. He's kind of taking up that theme again, and to protect human rights. Now, he's also very clearly determined to counter the rise of China and sees the more assertive foreign policy of China as the biggest threat to U.S. security. And so the final point that I'm trying to make here is that these two goals could very well be in tension with one another. The Biden administration simply may not be able to make the sacrifices and trade-offs that are necessary in confronting China without alienating certain European and other democratic allies, especially if those allies have a different view of what the nature of China's role in the world should be. And so that's a tension.
Can I follow up on this? And I think it's important to note here too that France's role, this is also a challenge to France's role in an attempt to carve out, and there was a question somewhat related to this, to carve out a different path in the Indo-Pacific region. So France has clearly signaled that it wants peace in the region, it has interests in the region, and it wanted to, in some senses, operate as a potential mediator between China and the United States over the long run. And so the submarine deal with Australia was a path to build some political support for a third way that wasn't yet explicitly making a choice between China and the United States. And so this deal kind of challenges France's autonomy to potentially carve out a path more independent from the United States and China in the Indo-Pacific region, and at the same time, it costs France a potential ally or partner in that third way. And so there's the military aspects of this, but this is part of the politics of this, in which it's constraining ultimately France's political influence in the region and its capacity or potential to maybe not make a choice yet between China and the United States.
And this is a good point, because a lot of countries, it's not just France, are facing this similar sort of constraints and dilemmas here. They don't want to alienate and disillusion China. They have strong, deep economic, especially, ties with them. And so if you watch all these countries in the region, like in Asia, but also even in Europe, there's some care being taken about, picking sides here, because, there's costs to choosing the American side in a world that has such a strong economic force in the economy of China.
And these same sets of dilemmas faced Europe during the Cold War too. Yeah. They were worried about getting too dependent on U.S. protection and getting dragged into a war between the United States and the Soviet Union that they didn't want to participate in. And so this is also part of this dynamic. If China and the United States are on this, in a sense, path towards tension over the next 2 or 3 decades or whatever, some countries are going to want to stay on the sidelines and not have to choose.
And in fact, I saw a story about parliamentary debate in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain, right, about this very deal. And there were British MPs saying, look, by participating in this deal, are we going to get dragged into a war between the United States and China? Theresa May, former prime minister of the country, was asking these questions. Yeah. And so this is putting a lot of countries in a difficult spot.
Yeah, and one way to interpret Australia's decision here is they have to make a choice.
Right.
And the time was to make a choice, and if the choice is going to be to side with the U.S., and the way to be in the best position to side with the U.S. is to integrate their militaries more extensively, right? And there's a concern about the technology associated with the French submarines, that they might be outdated by the time they're finally delivered in 15 years.
Right.
And so there's also a strategic and a technological argument that the Australians made, which is we need the most up-to-date submarines so we can participate and contain China's influence in the South China Sea, and the French subs might not be up to the task.
Right.
So.
And you know, even one last point, even you could flip this around, right? These countries that have problems, you know, they're stuck and they don't want to alienate China and they don't want to alienate the United States and they want to just stay on the sidelines. But there's also countries that want, you know, the deal Australia got too, and they are afraid of being too late to the party. You know, Japan and India, as part of the Quad, are like, hey, what about us? And in fact, the United States has had to clarify whether they would let Japan and India into this new pact. And they so far have said, no, I don't think so. But that's going to be a problem, right? Because Japan and India are going to want that kind of security relationship with the United States too, because they have their own fears about Chinese moves in the region. So this is a big deal.